situation.
And I grabbed the gun.
Trying to find the first place to put a body.
No, sir.
The only thing they could do was kill him.
You want to say anything?
We, the jury, need to find the defendant.
What did you do?
I yelled for my dad.
Did you see anything that was protruding or sticking out of your mom's body?
Yes.
What did you see?
Corn.
Some murders happen in crowded cities. Others happen where the only witnesses are the wind and the fields. On a cold November morning in rural Iowa, a 13-year-old boy walked toward a small red shed on his family's farm. His mother had gone there more than an hour earlier. She never came back. When he opened the door, he found her lying face down on the dirt floor. A heavy steel corn rake protruded from her back. Moments later, his father rushed inside. He pulled the rake from her body, lifted her into his truck, and called 911 while racing toward the hospital. At first, it sounded like a tragic farm accident. After all, farms are dangerous places. Heavy machinery, sharp tools, long hours, accidents happen every year. But investigators would soon discover something that made this scene almost impossible to believe. Amy Mullis didn't have one wound. She had 6, and the tool that supposedly caused them only had 4 steel tines. That impossible piece of mathematics would unravel an entire family's life. It would expose hidden affairs, millions of dollars at stake, years of controlling behavior, and internet searches prosecutors believed revealed a murder planned months in advance. But one question has divided people ever since. Did Todd Mullis brutally murder his wife to stop her from leaving him, or was he a grieving husband caught inside a terrible misunderstanding? Today, we're taking a deep dive into one of Iowa's most disturbing murder cases. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your country or city in the comments below. It's always incredible to see this community come together from all around the world. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Long before Amy Mullis became the center of a murder investigation, she was simply Amy Fuller. Born on January 23, 1979 in Ames, Iowa, Amy grew up surrounded by the rolling farmland of Hardin County. Friends remembered someone who didn't need to demand attention. She was naturally warm, easy to talk to, and the kind of person who made others feel comfortable within minutes of meeting her.
Very first told me the very first day that she was having an affair. I was so angry at her because I told her, you know, Amy, you're putting yourself in a really dangerous situation, and I said at that time, he is going to kill you.
And why did you say that?
Because Todd is just the person you don't.
After graduating from Eldora New Providence High School, Amy chose a profession that reflected who she was. She became a registered nurse, working first at St. Luke's Hospital in Cedar Rapids and later in the emergency department at the Regional Medical Center in Manchester. Amy built a career around helping complete strangers during some of the worst moments of their lives. Emergency rooms demand calm under pressure, quick decisions, compassion. Coworkers remembered Amy as someone who brought all three. She wasn't looking for recognition. She simply wanted to help. That caring nature followed her outside the hospital as well. Then, during the summer of 2003, everything changed. County fairs are woven into life across rural Iowa. Families gather to watch livestock competitions. Children run between food stalls. Farmers compare harvests and exchange stories. It was at one of those fairs in Delaware County that Amy met a local farmer named Todd Mullis. Todd seemed driven, hardworking, someone who had spent his entire life building something with his own hands. The relationship moved quickly. On September 11, 2004, they married. Amy left much of her previous life behind and moved to Todd's farm near Earlville, where they began building a future together. Before long, they welcomed 3 children into the world: Tristan, Taylor, Wyatt. Like many parents, Amy made a choice that would reshape her life. She stepped away from emergency nursing to devote more time to her growing family and help manage the expanding farming operation. She became deeply involved in farm life and also served on the Delaware County Pork Producers Board. Those closest to her would later say she embraced that life wholeheartedly. She loved farming. She loved being a mother. And above everything else, she loved her children. Friends remembered that nearly every conversation eventually found its way back to Tristan, Taylor, or Wyatt. She celebrated their smallest achievements. She planned her days around them. Everything she did it for them. Looking back now, those memories carry a different weight, because they remind us of something easy to lose in high-profile murder cases. Amy Mullis wasn't just a victim, she was a daughter, a nurse, a wife, a mother, a woman with plans for the future. And that future was about to collide with a marriage that, behind closed doors, was slowly beginning to fracture. From the outside, the Mullis family looked successful, a thriving farming business, 3 children, a respected place in the local community. But appearances can be remarkably deceptive. As investigators would later discover, the cracks had already begun to spread. And before long, those cracks would widen into something far more dangerous. Every murder investigation eventually arrives at the same question. Why? Why would someone risk everything? Why destroy the person they once promised to love? Sometimes the answer comes quickly. Other times, it hides beneath years of resentment, silence, and compromises that no one outside the marriage ever sees. For Todd and Amy Mullis, those cracks had been forming long before anyone realized how deep they had become. The first betrayal, no marriage survives untouched by betrayal. In 2013, Amy had an affair with a man she met through work. It was a painful chapter, one that could easily have ended the marriage. Instead, the couple tried to save it. Encouraged by friends, they entered marriage counseling, determined to repair what had been broken. According to people who knew them, they appeared to reconcile and move forward. From the outside, it looked like they had survived. But appearances can be misleading, because forgiveness isn't always the same as healing. Sometimes resentment doesn't disappear, it simply waits. A different man over the years that followed, Amy's friends began noticing changes. Not dramatic changes, subtle ones, the kind that are easy to dismiss when viewed individually. Todd wanted to know where Amy was, who she was with, how long she'd been gone. If she stopped somewhere unexpectedly, he wanted an explanation. Friends said he monitored her movements, questioned her whereabouts, and expected her to account for nearly every minute she spent away from home. To outsiders, it looked less like concern and more like control. Eventually, her friends even gave it a nickname, Prisoner of Todd. Amy laughed when they used it. But those closest to her would later wonder whether that laughter had been covering something much darker. Sometimes humor becomes the safest way to talk about pain. A farm worth millions for Todd Mullis. Farming wasn't simply a career, it was his identity. He had started working the land as a boy. Over the years, he expanded the operation until it stretched across multiple farms worth millions of dollars. Everything he had built, financially and personally, was tied to that land. Friends later recalled something Todd said whenever divorce came up. "I'm not going to lose my farm and what I've worked for." At the time, it sounded like frustration, a husband venting. But investigators would later hear those words differently, because if Amy divorced him, the consequences could be enormous. Property, equipment, livestock, assets accumulated over decades. A divorce wouldn't simply end a marriage. It could fundamentally change the future of the farming business Todd had spent his life building. That possibility would later become one of the prosecution's central theories of motive. The second affair then came the summer of 2018. Amy met Jerry Frazier. He worked as the field manager on the Mullis farm. What began as a relationship between coworkers eventually became an affair. According to later testimony, Jerry described the relationship as largely physical from his perspective, though he believed Amy's feelings may have gone deeper. The two exchanged numerous text messages, and Amy confided to a close friend that she wanted a divorce. Todd eventually noticed something was different. He reviewed phone records, counted text messages, became increasingly suspicious. He even contacted Jerry's wife, hoping to understand what was happening. But by then, the marriage was already heading toward a breaking point. Only now, both husband and wife seemed to understand it. The difference was, they imagined very different futures. Amy reportedly wanted to leave. Todd had already made it clear what losing the farm would mean to him. The last by November 2018, life on the Mullis farm carried on as usual. Winter was approaching. The farm was preparing for a new delivery of piglets. Long days, cold mornings, routine work. Amy had recently undergone outpatient surgery. She was still recovering physically. Even so, She joined Todd and their 13-year-old son Tristan to help with the morning's work. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then Amy began feeling unwell. She complained that she was dizzy, weak, unsteady on her feet. At one point, she climbed onto a bucket simply to steady herself. Her legs were shaking. Todd told her she should head back to the house and rest. But before she did, he asked her to stop at one of the sheds and bring back a pet carrier. It sounded like an ordinary request. One more task before taking a break. Amy walked away from the hog barn toward the red shed. No one realized it would be the last time they would ever see her alive. Before we continue, if you're enjoying these in-depth true crime documentaries and appreciate the research that goes into them, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel continue producing carefully researched stories like this, and you'll never miss our next investigation. More than an hour passed. No one saw Amy return. Finally, Todd asked Tristan to go and check on his mother. The 13-year-old walked across the property toward the shed. Seconds later, his life changed forever. He found Amy lying face down. A steel corn rake protruded from her back. Within minutes, Todd would pull the tool from her body, lift her into his truck, and make a frantic 911 call that investigators would replay countless times in the months ahead. At first, everyone believed they were looking at a tragic accident. But accidents don't usually leave behind questions that refuse to go away. For the first few minutes, everyone believed Amy Mullis had suffered a terrible accident. A farm, heavy equipment, sharp tools. It was tragic, but not impossible. Then investigators looked closer, and almost immediately, the story stopped making sense. The 911 call on November 10, 2018, Todd Mullis sped toward Regional Medical Center in Manchester, with Amy in the passenger seat of his pickup truck. As he drove, he called 911. His voice was urgent. He told the dispatcher his wife had been injured by a corn rake. She wasn't responding. He needed help. Paramedics rushed to meet them. Doctors did everything they could. But the injuries were catastrophic. Amy Mullis was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. News spread quickly through the small farming community. People were heartbroken. Amy was well known, a respected nurse, a devoted mother, someone who had spent years caring for others. Few imagined that within days, her death would become the center of a homicide investigation. Something was wrong. Delaware County investigators returned to the farm to examine the scene. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. The red shed stood exactly where Todd said it was. The steel corn rake was there. Everything looked consistent with a workplace accident until the medical examiner completed the autopsy. Amy hadn't suffered one fatal wound, or two. She had suffered 6 separate puncture wounds. Detectives looked back at the rake. It had only 4 steel tines. That raised an obvious question. How do 4 tines create 6 wounds? Even more troubling, forensic pathologists determined that several injuries appeared to have been inflicted while Amy was still alive, not as she had fallen. According to prosecutors, the pattern suggested repeated force rather than a single accidental fall. The accident theory was beginning to collapse. The timeline investigators carefully reconstructed the morning. Amy had recently undergone surgery. She wasn't feeling well. Witnesses described her becoming dizzy while helping around the farm. Todd admitted he asked her to retrieve a pet carrier from the shed. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw her alive. More than an hour passed. Eventually, their 13-year-old son, Tristan, went looking for his mother. He found her lying face down, a corn rake embedded in her back. For detectives, the timeline raised difficult questions. If Amy had accidentally fallen, why had no one heard her? Why had she remained alone for so long? And why did the injuries appear inconsistent with a simple fall? The more investigators reconstructed the morning, the less convincing the accident explanation became. A phone full of secrets, then the investigation took another turn. Detectives obtained search warrants for phones and electronic devices. What they found expanded the case far beyond the events inside the shed. Investigators discovered thousands of text messages documenting Amy's relationship with Jerry Frazier. The messages painted the picture of a marriage in crisis. Amy spoke about leaving, about divorce, about beginning a different life. For prosecutors, those messages established something important: a motive. If Amy ended the marriage, Todd could face enormous financial consequences tied to the farming operation he had spent decades building. But detectives weren't finished, because another digital discovery would prove just as significant. The Internet Search's investigators examined Todd's internet activity. Among the searches they uncovered were queries related to marriage, infidelity, and financial consequences connected to divorce. Standing alone, none of those searches proved murder. People search personal problems every day, but prosecutors argued they became meaningful when viewed alongside everything else: a deteriorating marriage, a planned divorce, a multi-million-dollar farming operation, an affair, and now a wife who was dead. Each discovery seemed to reinforce the same possibility. This hadn't been an accident, it had been a homicide. Detectives interviewed friends, co-workers, family members, and neighbors. A consistent picture began to emerge. Several witnesses described Todd as controlling. Others recalled Amy expressing fear about the future of the marriage. Friends testified that she intended to leave. Coworkers described the emotional strain she had been carrying during the final months of her life. Individually, those conversations might not have carried much weight. Together, they painted a picture of a marriage rapidly approaching its breaking point. The arrest nearly two years after Amy's death, investigators believed they finally had enough evidence. Todd Mullis was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He denied killing his wife. From the very beginning, his defense remained the same. Amy's death had been a tragic accident, nothing more. But prosecutors believed the forensic evidence told a completely different story. A story of repeated blows, of financial motive, of a marriage beyond repair, and of a husband who couldn't accept the future his wife had chosen. Before we continue, if you've been enjoying this documentary, I'd really appreciate your support. Subscribing helps us continue producing long-form, carefully researched true crime investigations like this one. If that's the kind of content you enjoy, consider joining our community. The trial that followed would divide opinions across Iowa. The defense would insist investigators had turned a farming accident into a murder case. The prosecution would argue the physical evidence made an accident virtually impossible. Everything now rested on 12 jurors. Their decision would determine whether Todd Mullis was a grieving husband or a calculated killer. Some murder trials are decided by a confession. Others are decided by science. This one would be decided by whether 12 jurors believed a farm accident could really happen the way Todd Mullis claimed. For nearly 2 years, detectives had worked to reconstruct the final hours of Amy Mullis's life. Every interview, every forensic report, every text message, every photograph from the crime scene. Now, all of it would be placed before a jury. The question wasn't whether Amy had died. Everyone agreed she had.
Right there, do you say go to hell, cheating whore?
No.
So you don't hear that?
No.
The question was far more difficult. How did she die? The Trial Begins in September 2021, Todd Mullis stood before a Delaware County jury charged with the first-degree murder of his wife. He pleaded, not guilty. From the very first day, the courtroom became a battle between two completely different versions of the same morning. The prosecution argued that Todd intentionally killed Amy to stop her from leaving the marriage. The defense insisted investigators had misunderstood a tragic farming accident. Only one version could be true. The prosecution's case prosecutors didn't rely on one dramatic piece of evidence. Instead, they built their case one piece at a time. First came the marriage. Jurors heard about Amy's affair with Jerry Frazier. They learned she had discussed divorce with friends. Witnesses described a relationship that had become increasingly strained. Then came the financial picture. The farming operation represented decades of work and millions of dollars in assets. Prosecutors argued Todd believed divorce could threaten everything he had built. But motive alone doesn't prove murder. The forensic evidence would become the heart of the trial. Medical experts explained that Amy suffered 6 puncture wounds, despite the corn rake having only 4 tines. They testified that the injuries were inconsistent with a simple accidental fall. According to the prosecution's experts, the wounds suggested repeated force, not a single unfortunate accident. The courtroom fell silent as jurors studied photographs and listened to detailed medical testimony. The science spoke louder than emotion. The defense fights back. Todd's attorneys challenged almost every conclusion. They argued farming accidents are unpredictable, that unusual injuries can occur in chaotic circumstances, that investigators had become so convinced Todd was guilty, they ignored alternative explanations. The defense maintained the same position they had held from the beginning. Amy accidentally fell onto the rake. Todd had desperately tried to save her. He was a grieving husband, not a murderer. Over several days, jurors listened to investigators, medical experts, friends, family members, and forensic specialists. Each witness added another small piece to an increasingly complicated puzzle. Some described Amy's plans for the future. Others recalled Todd's concerns about losing the farm. Digital evidence revealed thousands of messages documenting Amy's relationship with Jerry Frazier. The prosecution argued those messages showed Amy was preparing to leave. The defense argued they proved only that the marriage was struggling. Nothing more. As always, the same evidence supported two completely different stories. The jury had to decide which one made more sense. Before we hear the verdict, I'd like to ask you something. Cases like this often divide opinion because there isn't one single piece of evidence that answers every question. What do you think so far? Do you believe the prosecution has proved its case, or do you still think this could have been a tragic accident? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read as many of your comments as I can, and it's always interesting to see how differently people interpret the same evidence. The verdict, after listening to weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. For Todd Mullis, everything now rested in the hands of 12 strangers. Hours later, they returned to the courtroom. The foreperson stood. The clerk asked for the verdict. Guilty. Todd Mullis was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Amy Mullis. The judge later sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Amy's family, it was a moment of relief. For Todd's supporters, it was a heartbreaking conclusion. Even after the verdict, the debate continued. The appeals. Like many convicted defendants in high-profile murder cases, Todd Mullis appealed his conviction. His legal team challenged aspects of the trial and continued to argue that the evidence did not establish murder beyond a reasonable doubt. As of the information contained in our source material, those legal efforts have continued through the appellate process. Regardless of where those legal proceedings ultimately lead, Amy Mullis never came home. 3 children lost their mother. Parents lost their daughter. Friends lost someone they described as compassionate, generous, and deeply devoted to helping others. That reality has never changed. Amy's legacy. It's easy to remember Amy Mullis because of how she died. But perhaps the better way to remember her is by how she lived. She spent years caring for patients in emergency rooms. She devoted herself to raising 3 children. She embraced life on the family farm. She built friendships that lasted decades. Those who knew her rarely described her accomplishments first. They talked about her kindness, her laugh, her willingness to help without expecting anything in return. Sometimes, those are the details that matter most, because murder victims deserve to be remembered for more than the crime that ended their lives. In the quiet countryside of Iowa, the fields eventually grew green again. The farm continued. Seasons changed, harvests came and went. But for one family, time never truly moved forward. Every gate, every barn, every path across that property carries the memory of a morning that changed everything. Whether you believe the evidence left room for doubt, or you still have unanswered questions, the story of Amy Mullis is ultimately a reminder that the deepest tragedies often unfold far from public view, behind ordinary doors, inside ordinary families, where no one else can see what's happening until it's too late. If you found this documentary thoughtful and well-researched, please consider subscribing to the channel. We publish long-form true crime documentaries that focus on the evidence, the investigation, and the people at the center of each case. And before you go, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your country or city in the comments, and if there's another case you'd like us to cover, let us know there as well. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and thank you for watching.